My stepmother threw away my mother's photos on a Sunday morning like it was a normal chore. She had a trash bag and she went through the living room shelf by shelf pulling frames down, not even looking at the faces in them. I walked in halfway through and she turned to me and said it without blinking. "She's gone. Get over it." I looked at my father. He looked at the floor. I was the only one in that house who knew what my mother had actually left behind. Not just memories, not just photographs. My mother had been a very organized, very private, and very deliberate woman. And 2 weeks before she passed, she had handed me a sealed envelope and told me to open it only when I felt like I had no options left. Standing in that living room watching her photographs disappear into a trash bag, I finally understood what she meant. I went upstairs. I opened the envelope, and everything changed. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 33 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized house in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of a house where the neighbors know your name but still pretend not to see you when you're taking out the trash at 7 a.m. in your pajamas. I was an only child. My mother, Eleanor Cole, raised me with the kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself. She didn't shout. She didn't give long speeches. She just did things. She kept records. She kept receipts. She kept every single important document in a fireproof box under her bed, labeled, organized, and dated. I used to tease her about it. I'd say, "Mom, you are one color-coded folder away from being a supervillain." She'd just look at me and say, "Nathan, when the time comes, you'll be glad." She was right. She was always right, even from beyond the grave, which honestly is impressive and also a little terrifying. My father, Robert Cole, was a good man. I want to say that clearly and mean it because what I'm about to tell you doesn't reflect the man I grew up watching coach my little league team and fall asleep during every single Sunday night movie. My dad was a good man who made one catastrophically bad decision after losing the woman who kept his whole world in order. That bad decision had a name. Her name was Diane. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these stories matter. Diane came into the picture about 14 months after my mother passed. My mother died of pancreatic cancer. It moved fast. She was diagnosed in January and gone by September. We didn't even fully process the funeral before the world kept moving, which is the cruelest thing about grief. Nobody pauses a clock for you. My dad was devastated. Genuinely, I watched that man lose 15 pounds and start burning his morning eggs because he'd forget the stove was on. He was not okay, and grief does something to people. It creates this enormous, aching hole right in the center of your chest, and some people, not all people, but some people will walk into that hole and set up camp before you even realize the door is open. Diane was a colleague of my father's, or at least that's the story. She was 44 to his 58. She had that very specific kind of polished energy, the kind where everything is neat and deliberate, but you can't quite put your finger on why it feels off. Like a kitchen that looks clean, but you wouldn't want to eat off the floor. She started appearing at family dinners about 8 months after my mother died. By month 10, she was at our house more than I was. By month 14, my father sat me down and told me they were getting married. I didn't explode. I didn't threaten anyone. I was 31 years old. I was not going to throw a tantrum on my father's kitchen floor. But I remember sitting across from him at that table thinking, "Dad, something is wrong with her." I could feel it the way you feel a splinter you can't quite see yet. You know it's in there. You know it's going to hurt. You just can't prove it yet. The wedding was small. 6 months later, Diane moved in full time. And that's when the slow erasure began. It started with small things. She rearranged the furniture. Okay, fine. She replaced the curtains. Fine. She put her own mugs in the cabinet and quietly moved my mother's hand-painted ceramic set, the one my mother had made herself at a pottery class. to the back of the highest shelf. I said nothing. I watched. Then she started working on my father's memory in a different way. Not obviously. Not with speeches. She'd say things like, "I know Eleanor did it this way, but I really think this works better." Or she'd bring up some minor thing my mother apparently did wrong. Some forgotten bill, some missed appointment. As though building a case file I wasn't supposed to notice. I noticed. Then came the Sunday with the trash bag. I had come over for brunch. My father had invited me. I walked in through the side door. I still had a key. This was still technically my childhood home. And I found Diane in the living room with a large black trash bag, working her way through the shelves like she was on a deadline. She had already pulled down the photos from a mantle. The graduation picture, the one of my parents at Niagara Falls on their 20th anniversary, the one of my mother holding me in the hospital the day I was born. She was about to drop that last one in the bag when she heard me walking. She turned around. No flinch. No guilt. She just looked at me and said, "She's gone. Get over it." And then she kept going. I looked at my father. He was sitting on the couch, not standing up, not saying anything, just sitting there like a man who had already decided that keeping the peace was more important than keeping the memory of the woman he had been married to for 26 years. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I said nothing. I turned around, walked upstairs to my old bedroom, closed the door, sat on the edge of the bed, and I opened my mother's envelope. Let me tell you about that envelope because every single thing that happened after came from what was inside it. My mother had prepared 4 things. The first was a handwritten letter, 2 pages. She wrote it in her neat, unhurried cursive, the kind that looks like she had all the time in the world, even though she was running out of it. The letter started with "My darling Nathan," and I had to stop and take a breath before I could keep reading. She told me she loved me. She told me she was proud of me. And then she told me she had some concerns. She said she had noticed some things in the months leading up to her illness that bothered her. She didn't know if they meant anything, but she wanted me to be aware. She said that when she was first diagnosed, she had quietly consulted with her attorney, a woman named Patricia Wren, without telling my father. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she had always believed that a woman should have her own arrangements, separate and protected, regardless of how much she loved her husband. The second thing in the envelope was a business card. Patricia Wren is state attorney, Columbus, Ohio. The third thing was a 1-page document. It was a summary of what my mother had done with her attorney. And this is where I had to read it 3 times before it fully landed. My mother owned the house, not jointly, not 50-50. My mother owned it. When they had purchased a home 22 years earlier, my mother had paid for it outright using an inheritance from her own parents, my grandparents on her side, both of whom had passed before I was old enough to remember them. The deed had always been in her name alone, and 3 months before she died, without a word to my father, she had transferred the house into a revocable living trust, with me as the sole beneficiary. She had also transferred a separate investment account, roughly $41,000, into the same trust. My father had no legal claim to the house. He had been living in it, yes. He had paid utilities and maintenance and considered it their home, yes. But the title, the trust, the legal ownership, that belonged to Eleanor Cole. And now, per the terms of the trust, it belonged to Nathan Cole. The fourth thing in the envelope was a sticky note, for words in my mother's handwriting. Don't act in anger. I sat on that bed for a long time. I heard Diane downstairs, moving things around, the sound of picture frames being stacked. I heard my father's voice, low and agreeing with whatever she was saying. I sat there holding that sticky note, and I made a decision. I was not going to do anything that day. I was not going to storm downstairs. I was not going to call Patricia Wren from a driveway. I was not going to hand Diane a legal document over brunch. I was going to be patient. I was going to be thorough, and I was going to do it right. I called Patricia Wren on Monday morning. She remembered my mother warmly. She said Eleanor had been one of the sharpest clients she'd ever worked with, organized, clear-headed, and absolutely certain about what she wanted. Patricia confirmed everything the document had said. The trust was valid. The house was mine. My mother's investment account had already been transferred to a separate account held in the trust, which Patricia had been managing. The total, with modest growth over 2 years, was now closer to $47,000. I asked Patricia what my options were. She walked me through them calmly, like we were discussing a real estate transaction and not the slow demolition of my childhood home by a woman with a trash bag and no shame. I had the legal right to notify my father that the house was no longer his to occupy indefinitely. I could give him a formal notice period and handle it through the courts if necessary. I could also, if I wanted, simply sell the house outright and split nothing, because there was nothing to split. The house was mine. Your mother was very careful, Patricia said. I said she always was. I hung up the phone and I sat in my apartment. I had my own place, a 2-bedroom in German Village. And I thought about what it meant to do this correctly. Because here's the thing about revenge. When you do it wrong, you end up looking like the villain. You yell, you threaten, you send one too many late-night texts, and suddenly everyone at Thanksgiving is talking about your instability instead of the actual crime. I was not going to be the unstable one. I was going to be the patient one, the prepared one, the one who, when the moment finally came, didn't have to raise his voice even once. I gave myself 2 years, not because I had to, because I wanted to do it right. I wanted every single thread pulled tight before I made my move. Now, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it right now. I promise you, what happens next in this story is going to absolutely floor you. Hit that subscribe button and let's keep going. The first thing I did was document everything. Every visit to my father's house, which was legally my house, though I held that knowledge close. I took note. I started keeping a journal, not in some dramatic, leather-bound diary kind of way, just a plain notes app on my phone. Dates, observations, things Diane said, because I had learned something from watching her operate. She was strategic. She didn't do anything dramatic or explosive. She worked slowly and quietly. And if you weren't paying attention, you'd mistake her maneuvering for normal married life. She had already removed all of my mother's photos. That was done. But then she started working on the house itself. She began talking about renovations. She wanted to repaint the living room, change the kitchen backsplash, put in new flooring. My father, bless his heart, thought this was a sign of her investing in their future together. I watched the invoices appear on the kitchen counter during my visits. Contractors coming and going. One afternoon, I arrived to find a designer walking through my mother's house with a clipboard, pointing at walls and nodding approvingly. I smiled. I nodded. I took photos on my way out. There was also the matter of money. Diane had gradually taken over the household finances. She had moved my father's accounts to a joint account at her preferred bank. She had convinced him to put her name on things, the car, a small savings account. She had a way of framing financial decisions that made them sound like love. It just makes more sense for us to share everything, Robert. That's what real commitment looks like. My father ate up. He was a man who had always been handled lovingly in his first marriage, and he didn't notice that being handled by Diane felt completely different. Same rhythm, very different song. I also, during this period, did something I'm not proud of in the sense that it required me to be in close proximity to Diane for extended periods without flinching. I was nice to her, I know. I know. But here's why. I needed her comfortable. I needed her to believe that Nathan Cole had accepted his situation, that he had swallowed his grief and moved on and was a reasonable young man who simply loved his father and wanted good things for the family. So I came to Sunday brunches. I brought wine. I asked her about her week. I laughed at her stories. I complimented the new curtains that she had put up over the windows where my mother's curtains used to hang. And every single time I drove home afterward, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 5 minutes before going inside, just to reset. My friend Tyler, who knew everything because I had told him after about 3 weeks because I needed one person to talk to or I was going to lose my mind, said I deserved an Oscar. I told him I just deserved a drink. He poured me a large one and said, 2 years is a long time, man. I said, good things take time. My mother would have agreed. During the first year, I also made a quiet discovery that I had not been expecting. I had been going through some of my mother's old records, things I had kept in storage after she passed. And I found a series of letters, not emails, physical letters handwritten, bundled with a rubber band. They were from before my parents got married, love letters from my father to my mother, which were frankly both sweet and deeply embarrassing in the way that all parental love letters are. But that's beside the point. Inside the same bundle was something else entirely, a folded newspaper clipping from a city in Indiana, South Bend, dated about 12 years earlier. It was a short article, local news, barely 3 paragraphs. It described a civil lawsuit that had been filed by the adult children of a recently deceased widower named Gerald Hartman. The children alleged that their father's new wife had convinced him, in the final 2 years of his life, to rewrite his will, remove his children as beneficiaries, and name her as the sole heir to his estate. The case had been settled out of court. No admission of wrongdoing. The wife's name in the article? Diane Hartman. Not her current last name, but the same Diane. I read that article 4 times. Then I called Patricia Wren. Patricia, being an attorney and therefore someone who responds to information like a doctor responds to symptoms, was very interested. She said it wasn't proof of anything on its own. A settled civil case with no admission of wrongdoing was just a data point. But paired with what was happening in my father's household, the financial consolidation, the removal of any trace of his previous life, the slow positioning of herself as the primary person in his financial picture, it was a pattern worth noting. We should document everything, Patricia said. Already am, I said. By month 18, I had a very clear picture of what Diane was doing. She was remaking my father's life in her image, piece by piece, the same way she had apparently attempted with Gerald Hartman in South Bend. She had already succeeded in getting her name onto 2 of my father's accounts. She had begun making comments, gently, always gently, about how it might make more sense for my father to update his will now that things had changed. My father mentioned this to me once almost in passing, over a baseball game on a Saturday afternoon. I nodded and changed the subject. Inside, I felt the clock tick. I also, during this period, had a private conversation with my father that I want to tell you about honestly. I drove over one afternoon when I knew Diane was at a conference in Cincinnati for 2 nights. Just the 2 of us. I brought food, his favorite, which is chicken parmesan from the Italian place on 5th Street, the kind with the thick bread that means you'll need a nap afterward. We sat at the kitchen table and ate. He asked about my work. I asked about his health. For while it was just a regular father-son dinner in a house full of memories, and for a minute I could almost forget everything I knew. Then I said gently, Dad, do you remember Mom's house? Do you remember that she paid for it with her parents' money? He looked up. He chewed slowly. Sure. Yeah. Her parents left her that money. Do you remember whose name was on the deed? He thought about it. Hers, I think. We always meant to put both our names on it, but we just never got around to it. He waved a hand, the way he always did when he was about to brush something under a rug. It's been the family home for 20-something years, Nathan. It's our house. Right, I said. I did not say anything else about it. But after that conversation, I went home and I wrote 3 words in my notes app. He doesn't know. My father genuinely did not know that the house was in a trust. My mother had made those arrangements quietly and carefully and had never burdened him with the details. He thought of it as their house because it always had been their home, even if it was legally something more specific than that. This changed things slightly for me, not the plan itself, but how I felt about my father. He wasn't a co-conspirator. He was just a man who didn't know what he didn't know, and who had, in his grief, opened a door to the wrong person. That made me sad in a way that was different from the anger I felt about Diane. Anger is clean. Sadness is a different kind of weight. I decided that when the time came, I would be honest with my father. Not cruel, honest. By month 21, everything was in place. Patricia had prepared all the legal documentation. We had the trust paperwork, the property records, the transfer history, everything organized in the same careful way my mother would have approved of. I had my notes app. I had the South Bend newspaper article, which Patricia had tracked down the full court records on, and which revealed significantly more detail than the 3-paragraph summary. I had records of the financial changes Diane had made since moving in. I had photographs of the house before and after the renovations, for which Diane had never sought my permission as the actual owner of the property. I also had something else, something I hadn't expected. About a month before the moment I had planned, I received a phone call from an unknown number. A woman's voice. She said, "Is this Nathan Cole, son of Eleanor Cole?" I said, "Yes." She said her name was Bridget Hartman. She was Gerald Hartman's daughter, from South Bend. She had found my name through Patricia's office. Patricia had quietly reached out through legal channels to see if there were other parties who might have relevant history. Bridget had been waiting for years for someone to call. She had boxes of documentation from her own experience with Diane, emails, financial records, a recording legal in Indiana of a conversation in which Diane had explicitly pressured an ailing man to change his estate documents. I sat down. Then I asked Bridget if she'd be willing to make a drive to Columbus. She said she'd been waiting 12 years to make that drive. The day I chose was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday. I had taken a half day from work. I dressed like I was going to a business meeting. Clean dark pants, a good button-down, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because my mother always said that how you show up matters, especially when it matters most. Patricia met me in the driveway of my father's house, my house, along with a colleague of hers named Mr. Abra, who handled the more formal property side of things. Bridget was parked on the street in a silver sedan, 2 boxes of documents in her back seat, ready if needed. I texted my father, "Coming over. Need to talk. It's important." He texted back, "Everything okay?" I said yes. "Just come to the door." I rang the bell. My father answered. He looked at me, then at Patricia and Mr. Abra standing on his porch, and something in his face shifted. Not fear exactly, more like the look of a man who has just heard a sound he can't identify and knows he needs to be paying attention. "Nathan, what's—" "Dad," I said, "can we come in? I need to show you something." Diane was inside. She was in the kitchen, and she came into the living room when she heard voices. She stopped when she saw Patricia. Something moved across her face, too, something faster and harder and much more specific than what had moved across my father's. She recognized the situation before it was explained to her. I sat down. I put a folder on the coffee table that used to hold my mother's photograph collection. I opened it. I said, "Dad, I'm going to tell you some things, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond. Can you do that?" He sat down. He nodded. Diane stood very still by the kitchen doorway. I told him about the trust. I showed him the documents. I showed him my mother's letter. I watched my father read his dead wife's handwriting, and I watched the color change in his face. Not anger, not at first, just a slow and heavy kind of understanding. Like a man realizing that a room he's been living in for years is actually a different shape than he thought. "She set this up," he said quietly, "before she died." "Yes." "She never told me." "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She was protecting you." "She was protecting us both," I said. "She just knew things might go in a direction neither of us could predict." Then I turned to the second part of the folder, the South Bend records, the lawsuit summary, the full court documents, the financial patterns from our own household that Patricia had documented. I did not address Diane directly, not yet. I kept my eyes on my father. I let the documents speak. I told him about Bridget Hartman. I told him that Diane had done this before, that there was a very clear, very documented history of a woman who identified grieving, comfortable men and systematically positioned herself to inherit what they had built over lifetimes. I said it without drama. I said it the way Patricia had helped me practice saying it. Clear, factual, undeniable. My father's face by this point had gone through about 6 different expressions. Diane, across the room, had not moved, but she had started to speak. Once, then twice, and both times she stopped herself, which told me everything I needed to know. An innocent person defend themselves. A caught person calculates. Finally she said, "Robert, Nathan is doing this out of grief. He's never accepted me." I let that hang in the air. Then I said, "Diane, the house is in my name. It has been in my name since my mother transferred it into trust 2 months before she died. You have been living in my house, renovating my house, and attempting to help my father rewrite his will. A will that has no bearing on this property because this property is not his to will." Patricia can explain the legal specifics. Patricia, to her credit, did exactly that, calmly and completely. The room was very quiet. My father looked at the folder. He looked at Diane. He looked at me. And then he said, and I will remember this for the rest of my life, "Diane, I need you to leave." She didn't move. "I need you to leave my son's house," he said. "Right now, please." She did leave, not gracefully. There was a period of sharp words and a slammed door, and a neighbor definitely peeked through a curtain across the street, which fair enough. Bridget Hartman, sitting in her silver sedan, watched Diane walk to her car and drive away without so much as a single piece of luggage, because there wasn't time for luggage, and also because Patricia had gently noted that removal of property during an active legal matter would not be advisable. Diane's attorney contacted Patricia 3 days later. For days after that, Diane agreed to vacate the property within 30 days and to make no claim on any assets held in the trust. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue the civil case that Bridget and I had been building with Patricia's help. Patricia was honest with me about the math. The civil case would have been a drawn-out, expensive fight with an uncertain outcome. The agreement got Diane out of the house, out of my father's finances, and out of our lives, with legal documentation making clear she had no claim to anything. She was gone in 26 days. But the story doesn't end there, because I told you there was a plot twist, and here it is. The week Diane moved out, I was back at the house, helping my father sort through things. What was hers, what was ours, what needed to go to storage. And we were going through the garage, which Diane had converted into something resembling a very organized staging area for her redesign projects. There were boxes, supplies, paint cans, folded drop cloths, and pushed into the back corner, behind a stack of shelving units she'd had delivered and never assembled, were 2 large flat plastic storage containers. The kind with lids that snap shut. Dusty, clearly untouched for a while. My father didn't know what was in them. I popped the lid on the first one. Photographs. Framed photographs. Every single one my mother had in that living room, stacked carefully in bubble wrap, organized by size. She hadn't thrown them away. She had kept them. I stood there in that garage for a long moment trying to understand it. And here's the conclusion I landed on. Diane was smart. Too smart to actually destroy things that might have sentimental or even monetary value. Some of my mother's frames were antique, the kind with gilded edges that you find at estate sales. Diane had put them in storage not out of sentimentality. Definitely not out of sentimentality, but because she was above all things practical. She had removed them from sight because she wanted my mother erased from a living space. But she hadn't destroyed them. She kept them in case they were worth selling. She'd kept them in a garage she controlled, in containers she planned to deal with when she had the time. She just ran out of time. I took that first frame out of the bubble wrap. It was the one of my mother holding me in the hospital the day I was born. She was smiling with her whole face, the kind of smile that doesn't know it's being photographed, the kind that's just actually happy. I had forgotten the exact details of that photo in 2 years of not seeing it. I stood in that garage and I cried, properly cried, the ugly kind. My dad came in and saw me and he just sat down on a paint can and cried too. We didn't say much. We didn't need to. We spent the rest of that afternoon putting every single photograph back, exactly where it had been. It has been 4 months since that day. The house is in my name. My father still lives in it. I had a separate conversation with Patricia about that. And I created a formal life estate arrangement that allows him to live there rent-free for the rest of his life. Because he is my father, and because my mother loved him, and because being right doesn't have to mean being cruel. The house goes to me fully after that, and I'm glad it will be handled cleanly the way my mother intended. My mother's photographs are back on the shelf. I had them cleaned and rehung, and I added a few new frames with photos I found in old albums, pictures I hadn't looked at in years. The living room looks like itself again, like her. My father is in therapy. He started going about 6 weeks after everything happened, on his own, without me suggesting it. He came to tell me one Sunday over the chicken parmesan from 5th Street. I had made it myself this time, and he said, "I think I made a lot of choices I need to understand better." I said that sounded healthy. He laughed a little. A small, rusty sound like a door that hasn't been opened in a while. We're rebuilding something. I don't know exactly what shape it'll take, but we're working on it. Bridget Hartmann and I have stayed in touch. She and her brothers never got back what Diane took from their father's estate. The settlement was what it was 12 years ago, and there's no undoing it. But she told me that knowing Diane had finally been stopped, that the pattern had been broken, meant something to her that she couldn't fully put into words. We talk sometimes on the phone. She's a good person. Her father raised good kids, which probably infuriated Diane more than she let on. As for Diane herself, I don't know exactly where she is now. I know that a copy of the full legal documentation from our case, along with Bridget's original court records, has been filed with the Ohio Bar Association and shared with relevant parties who may have an interest in patterns of financial elder manipulation. I also know that Patricia, who is quietly terrifying in the best possible way, had a long professional memory. The world is smaller than people like Diane count on. I think about my mother a lot, more than I used to, actually, which I didn't expect. You'd think that having resolved something, closed the loop, gotten justice, you'd feel lighter. And in some ways I do. But it also made space for the grief I had sort of set aside for 2 years while I was busy being strategic. All that patience, all that careful documentation, it was real and it worked. But it also meant I wasn't just sitting with the loss of her. I was doing something with it, and now the doing is done, and the missing is just the missing, which doesn't come with a plan. She was the kind of woman who saw things coming before anyone else did, who prepared quietly and completely and then folded the preparations away without making a fuss, who handed her son a sealed envelope and said, "Open it when you have no options left," and somehow knew exactly when that moment would come and exactly what would be needed. She left me a house. She left me documented proof. She left me the name of an attorney. She left me a sticky note that said, "Don't act in anger." She also, I think, left me the understanding that the most powerful thing you can do in the face of someone who treats you like you're nothing is simply to be exactly the opposite of what they think you are. Diane thought I was a grieving, sentimental kid who would swallow my loss and move on. She thought she could throw a trash bag's worth of my history away, and I would eventually forget. She thought my mother was gone. She never understood that my mother wasn't just a person. She was a plan, and the plan worked. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you. Genuinely, leave a comment below. I want to know what part hit you the hardest. And if someone in your life did something like this to yours, I hope this story gave you something to hold on to. Not just the revenge, the part about the envelope, the part about the patience, the part about knowing that sometimes the best response isn't the loudest one. It's the most prepared one. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this if you know someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next story.